A massive dimensional rift tears open the earth, and alien beasts pour onto the planet like a living tide. They don't just level cities. The viruses they carry can turn human men into bloodthirsty creatures. In just 15 years, human warriors have been nearly wiped out, leaving only a handful of female soldiers still fighting on the front lines. And Lise is the leader of this war-torn zone, while also being just a regular mother. One day, she and her husband Jack were celebrating their daughter's 15th birthday when the alarms started screaming. The monster army had already reached the city walls. The survivors had no choice but to abandon their homes and flee through a world burning around them. Lise stayed behind to organize the soldiers, while Jack was forced to take their daughter and board one of the evacuation trucks. No one even remembers how many times they've run like this. To ease the tension, one of the escorting soldiers started chatting about the monster's weakness. As long as you cut off their heads, they go down. But infected humans are a different story. You have to completely destroy their brainstem to finish them off. And even now, no one understands why the monsters only infect men. Suddenly, a burst of gunfire echoed outside the truck. The soldiers jumped out to investigate. Moments later, the shadow of a monster appeared behind the curtain. Everyone froze, barely daring to breathe. It wasn't until one survivor got a spike driven straight through his stomach that everyone finally snapped, screaming as they leapt off the truck and ran for their lives. The monsters had clearly broken through the soldiers' defense and caught up. Jack dragged his daughter under a truck, but the vehicle was flipped almost instantly. The two of them scrambled out and rolled beneath another car. Across from them, another mother and her young son were hiding in the shadows. The four of them exchanged a terrified, silent glance. Nobody dared make a sound. Then the boy was suddenly yanked away by a monster. Amy fought to keep the fear off her face, but another creature crept right up to them, shoving its hideous head under the car. But at the very last second, a soldier rushed in and cut the beast down. It was Lise, her mother, come to save them. But this was only the monster's vanguard. Riding in vehicles had become far too obvious, so the survivors had no choice but to scatter into the forest. Lise told Jack to take their daughter and keep moving. She'd stay behind with the remaining soldiers to hold the monsters off. Amy didn't want to leave, not like this, but Lisa's decision didn't waver for a second. After one painful final goodbye, Lise drew her sword and charged back into the battlefield. On the roadside, a man clutched an injured arm, and before long, black fluid began leaking from his eyes, a clear sign of mutation. One of the soldiers raised his rifle without hesitation, but Jack didn't follow the rest of the survivors to the next camp. Instead, he took his daughter straight toward the shoreline. Turns out he'd been planning their escape for a long time. There was a speedboat hidden on the beach, ready to go. Just as they were about to set off for a nearby island, a frantic scream for help echoed from the distance. Amy thought they could fit 2 more people on the boat, but Jack knew better. Kindness gets you killed in the apocalypse. Before he could argue further, the desperate man came stumbling toward them on his own, gun in hand, threatening the father and daughter to take him with them. Jack noticed the wound on the man's back. He was definitely infected. There was absolutely no way he'd let this guy on the boat. So Jack lied, saying the fuel for the boat was stored up ahead at the road. The man followed cautiously, keeping his weapon trained on Jack. That's when Jack turned around, slowly reaching for the knife hidden in his pocket. Back on the beach, Amy kept her eyes glued to the trail, until she finally saw her father returning with a pistol in hand. He claimed the man just ran off. Anyone else would call him out immediately, but Amy believed him without question. Together, father and daughter pushed the boat into the water and sped toward the nearest uninhabited island. In the blink of an eye, a full year passed. Every day, Amy sat on the cliffside, staring across the sea at the distant shore, where explosions and firefights erupted almost daily. She had no idea when, or if, her mother would ever come back. Jack, meanwhile, had lined the entire beach with landmines, partly to keep monsters out, and partly to stop dangerous humans from ever setting foot on their island. Through her binoculars, Amy spotted a monster wandering along the far-off shore. Jack reassured her that the creatures didn't have enough reach to detect anyone on their island, but their brains could transmit information to each other instantly. Amy couldn't help asking how her father knew so much. Jack's eyes darkened. Turns out he'd spent 5 brutal years fighting these things on the front lines. He knew someday he wouldn't be there to protect her. So during their entire time on the island, he never once slacked off on her training. No one knew how long the apocalypse would last. If Amy wanted to survive, she had to learn to defend herself. One day, on her usual trip to the cliffside, she spotted a figure on the beach below. Instinctively, she called out to them, then froze, remembering the landmines her father had planted. She screamed for them to stop, and the girl managed to halt just inches before stepping into danger. Maybe out of guilt, Amy brought the stranger to her hidden cave, the secret place she never told her father about. The girl had a wound on her forehead, but Amy didn't think much of it. After all, the monsters only infected men, right? When Amy asked what happened, the girl shared her story. She and her father had been on their way to visit her grandmother on the island when a monster suddenly burst out of the water and attacked them. Amy was stunned. The creatures could swim now? Who knew what they'd evolve into next? She headed home to grab some food for the girl. But halfway there, someone called her name. She turned around and froze. It was her mother, after more than a year apart. But before Amy could even process the joy, Lise suddenly screamed for her to run, and black fluid leaked from her eyes. Her mother had been infected. Amy let out a terrified scream and jolted awake inside the cave. It had all been a nightmare. Panicked, she sprinted home. When Jack demanded to know where she'd been, she lied and said she'd fallen asleep in the woods. Still shaken, she asked her father why men always mutated, while girls seemed immune. Jack sighed and shook his head. Nothing in this world was absolute. He remembered Lise mentioning that some women had been infected, just at a much lower probability. Amy hesitated. She struggled with the thought for a long time, but finally decided to bring the girl some food. She grabbed the last few cans they had at home. The two of them feasted inside the cave, completely unaware that Jack hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. He'd been surviving on weeds and tree bark. Thanks to the poor soil on the island, nothing they planted ever grew well. So Jack always saved the remaining canned food for his daughter. That afternoon, father and daughter went out for their usual training. Amy was on fire, hitting every target, nailing every drill. Jack couldn't have been prouder and insisted on sparring with her himself. But when Amy slipped behind a tree, ready to counter, she found Jack collapsed on the ground. She barely managed to drag him back home. Only then did she learn the truth. Her father had passed out from hunger. Their supplies had run out a long time ago. To Amy, waiting around was no better than dying slowly. She argued they should return to the mainland and fight alongside her mother. After all, she believed she was strong enough. But Jack stubbornly shook his head. He and Lise had made a pact long ago. She would come to the island within a year, no matter what. He told Amy to wait. Only someone who'd faced the monsters head-on could understand just how terrifying they truly were. He finished speaking, then reached under the bed and pulled out an iron sword. It was the very weapon Jack and Lise once used fighting side by side. And now, it was time to pass it down to their daughter. One day, she would stand on the battlefield just like her mother, cutting down enemies with her own blade. Early the next morning, Amy showed up at the cave, excited and proudly carrying her new sword, only to find that the girl was gone. The only thing left behind was a scatter of broken doll pieces. A surge of dread washed through her. Then, a faint sound stirred behind her. Amy turned around in confusion and froze in horror. The girl had transformed into a monster. It was Amy's first real fight, but her legs turned to jelly. She couldn't muster even a shred of strength. And just as the creature lunged, Jack arrived with a handgun in his grip. He put the infected girl down, but there wasn't a hint of relief on his face. Because monsters shared a psychic link. If one of them spotted this place, the others would soon swarm in. And almost as if the world wanted to confirm his worst fears, the ocean began to ripple, then churn, as countless shapes surged through the waves, heading straight for the island. Fortunately, Jack had prepared for this long ago. The landmines he'd planted along the beach would both warn them and slow the monsters down. All they needed to do was cross the mountain ridge and reach the far side of the island, where a boat was waiting. But Jack was barely holding himself together. Every few steps, he had to stop and catch his breath. Before long, a thunderous blast echoed from the distance. The mines had gone off. The creatures had already made landfall. Gritting through the pain, Jack urged Amy forward. When they reached a narrow log bridge, he told his daughter to go first. It was basic training material, something she'd practiced countless times. For Amy, it was nothing. But when it was Jack's turn to cross, an infected suddenly tackled him from behind. Amy sprinted back, drew her sword, and sliced the creature's head clean off. But to her shock, the monster still kept moving, until Jack stomped down and crushed its brain stem, finally ending its life. After crossing the bridge, the two pushed deeper into the forest. That was when another infected emerged from the dense undergrowth. Jack collapsed to the ground, completely drained. He no longer had the strength to fight. This one would be up to Amy, and the girl did not disappoint. Her sword spun in her hands, blooming into a graceful arc before she neatly severed the creature's head. Jack figured these two infected were most likely the cave girl's family, and their time was running out. The father and daughter picked up their pace, heading straight for the shoreline. In the distance, they finally spotted the same motorboat they'd arrived in. Jack told Amy that all she had to do was cut the rope and pushed the boat into the water. He'd stay behind to buy her some time. But the girl refused outright. There was no way she was leaving her father alone. Jack pulled back his shirt and showed her the bite wound on his shoulder. This was as far as he could go with her. The monster's roars were getting closer and closer. With tears welling in her eyes, Amy sprinted toward the boat. She sliced through the rope with a clean stroke, only for the boat to stay completely still. The rails underneath had rusted solid. Amy threw every ounce of strength she had into pushing it, but it didn't budge an inch. Meanwhile, Jack was barely standing. He had nothing left. Faced with an absolutely hopeless situation, Amy didn't flinch. She drew her sword like a true warrior, ready to go down fighting. But right then, the roar of an engine exploded behind her. Her mother, Lise, had arrived. And as the swarm of monsters came pouring toward them like a tidal wave, the family of three braced themselves for a final, all-or-nothing battle. And that's where the story just cuts off. Honestly, the early marketing for this movie was pretty solid. Post-apocalyptic monsters, a survival setup, and even Mila in the cast. But once the actual film dropped, it became painfully clear that none of that hype matched what we got on screen. My advice? Just watch a recap like this one. The full movie will only leave you disappointed.